War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning is a 2002 book by Chris Hedges. It is an exemplary and extremely emotionally challenging read. It is an extensive meditation on Hedges' war experiences from the perspective of a reporter with decades spent in war zones. It is a book that offers explanations without answers. Why is war constant? Why do civilized human beings with no history of psychopathy, yet intoxicated by war, act as brutally as the worst sociopaths? Why otherwise peaceable societies become caught up in a fever of violent rhetoric, reducing even the genteel and well-educated into drooling thugs? Why those who march off to wars leave with conviction and optimism, yet return wrecked shells devoid of moral certainties? How each of us can believe in love and in family and in community, yet champion humanity's worst horrors. We say we're humanists, or we say we're saved or committed to justice, yet we support humanity's worst instincts. Work daily to make lives better, yet flirt immodestly with ideologically driven mass death and destruction. This book tackles these questions without a scientific or grand philosophical pretension. We can see the truth in the author's statements, feel our delusions peel away with each page, and come away educated, yet still hopeless. This is an important book, not because it will change anything, but because it is a clear and humane scream of pain in a world, sadly, populated by the deaf. From Chris Hedges' Wikipedia page. Christopher Lynn Hedges, born September 18, 1956, is an American journalist, Presbyterian minister, author, and left-wing commentator. In his early career, Hedges worked as a freelance war correspondent in Central America for the Christian Science Monitor, NPR, and Dallas Morning News. Hedges reported for the New York Times from 1990 to 2005, and served as the Times Middle East bureau chief and Balkan bureau chief during the wars in the former Yugoslavia. In 2001, Hedges contributed to the New York Times staff entry that received the 2002 Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting for the paper's coverage of global terrorism. Hedges produced a weekly column for Truth Dig for 14 years until the outlet's hiatus in 2020. His books include War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, 2002, a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction, American Fascists, The Christian Right and the War on America, 2007, Death of the Liberal Class, 2010, and Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, 2012, written with cartoonist Joe Sacco. Hedges hosted the television program On Contact for RT America from 2016 to 2022. He is an outspoken critic of American liberalism and has described himself as a socialist and as an anarchist. From the Wikipedia page for the book, quote, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning is a 2002 nonfiction book by journalist Chris Hedges. In the book, Hedges draws on classical literature and his experiences as a war correspondent to argue that war seduces entire societies, creating fictions that the public believes and relies on to continue to support conflicts. He also describes how those who experience war may find it exhilarating and addictive. The book was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction and a Los Angeles Times Best Book of the Year, as well as a national bestseller. Hedges describes the book as, quote, not written to dissuade us from war, but to understand it, so that we, who wield such massive force across the globe see within ourselves the seeds of our own obliteration." Close quote. Reviewer Abraham Verghese concludes that war, seduction, and inevitability, and sometimes even necessity, are a recurring theme in this book. So let's dive into the content. Part 1. The Myth of War. The book starts off from the perspective of the general public. The first chapter of the book is dedicated to describing the overwhelming sentiment that grows among any community that is heading to war. Hedges describes this sentiment as, quote, "The myth of war creates a new artificial reality. Moral precepts, ones that we've spent a lifetime honoring, are jettisoned. We accept, if not condone, the maiming and killing of others as the regrettable cost of war. We operate under a new moral code." Close quote. It is a phenomenon that everyone who lives long enough will get an opportunity to observe, and too often, too tragically, to participate in. It is the mania for violence that immediately overwhelms critical thought and encourages everyone to adopt and use the same dogmatic phrases. It is the widespread use of the term Slava Ukraine or Putin's war. It is the same phenomenon that gripped the US following the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center. In the months following that event, the US populace accepted many government activities that would have been wildly unpopular earlier. Massive increases in public surveillance and restrictive security measures directly affecting America's daily lives were accepted because they were generally thought to be necessary to conduct the war on terror. It allowed for a largely unilateral invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. Military actions that were different in rationale, but in practice very similar to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. All of this can happen because a previously divided and factional public suddenly becomes accepting of a unifying set of claims. Quote, "The political theorist Richard Jackson has argued that the war on terror, therefore, is simultaneously a set of actual practices, war, covert operations, agencies, and institutions, and an accompanying series of assumptions, beliefs, justifications, and narratives. It is an entire language or discourse." Jackson cites among many examples a statement by John Ashcroft that the attacks of September 11th drew a bright line of demarcation between civil and the savage. Administration officials also described terrorists as hateful, treacherous, barbarous, mad, twisted, perverted, without faith, parasitical, inhuman, and most commonly, evil. Americans, in contrast, were described as brave, loving, generous, strong, resourceful, heroic, and respecting of human rights. Close quote. What makes this war rhetoric special isn't that it's true or untrue, isn't that it's propaganda, isn't that it's good or bad. What makes war rhetoric special is that, strangely, it's more compelling than most other political rhetoric, and that it is mythological. The most dangerous time to be a social critic is in a time of war. Most people would welcome or at least tolerate public criticism in times of peace. But when war fever strikes, suddenly such speech becomes dangerous, treasonous, and deeply transgressive. The myth of war results in the social domination of a pro-war belief, a deeply felt sense of necessity and righteousness. Hedge uses the word myth, and I'd argue that it's myth in the same way that Christianity is a myth, is probably mythological, but people are converted to it as if it's an unshakable belief. It is a myth that facilitates a cult of death. Two, the plague of nationalism. Once on the road to war, societies will also jettison their rational and humanistic beliefs in favor of an outrageous, rabid form of nationalism. Quote, "It reduces and at times erases the anxiety of individual consciousness. We abandon individual responsibility for shared, unquestioned, communal enterprise, however morally dubious. The nationalist is, by definition, an ignoramus," wrote Daniel Kisz, the Yugoslav writer. "Nationalism is the line of least resistance, the easy way." The nationalist is untroubled. He knows or thinks he knows what his values are. That is to say, national. That is to say, the value of the nation he belongs to, ethical and political. He's not interested in others. They are of no concern. Hell, it's other people, other nations, other tribes. They don't even need investigating. The nationalist sees other people in his own image as nationalists. Close quote. Once this fever takes hold, the individual who can reach across tribal lines and identify with the enemy becomes an unquestionably rare breed. There is a terrifying indifference to the suffering of others. People believe anyone in the other category is guilty. In the blinding light of nationalist self-glorification, many become silent accomplices. Perhaps most startling aspect of this phenomenon is how after a defeat, this mania, this mass delusion, will disappear as if it never existed. Hedges writes describing Argentina following the Falklands War, quote, "As if the collective intoxication was nothing more than a bad dream, a drunken night of debauchery, best forgotten and impolite to mention. One felt dirty to bring it up." Close quote. Hedges doesn't attempt to diagnose or to categorize this phenomenon, focusing rather on example after example observed in the real world. What he does make clear is its ubiquity and how horrifyingly few people display any immunity. It is as if we wake up to find ourselves with dissociative identity disorder, with one personality that is rational, calm, and kind, and a completely separate that is inbred, traumatized moron seeking an opportunity to act out his irrational hatred and violent fantasies. A frightening inability to control ourselves, hiding under a lifetime of cultivated, decent personality. Three, the destruction of culture. In a similar way to the spread of maniacal nationalism, forms of authentic culture are also ruthlessly stamped out during times of war. Authentic culture, as Hedges defines it, quote, "is that which allows us to question and examine ourselves and our society. While in maniacal nationalism, the universe is starkly divided between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. The cause is celebrated, often in overt religious forms. All is dedicated to promoting and glorifying the myth, the nation, and the cause." Close quote. There is an accompanying call for self-sacrifice and a glorification of death. This is more than a call for a citizen's responsibility, but a call for self-annihilation. This common narrative is more often than not forced upon a society, certainly by governments, but often by religious or other cultural institutions as well. The narrative supports only the cause, and it makes any form of public truth impossible. Four, the seduction of battle and the perversion of war. The overwhelmingly social nature of war that propagates nearly irresistible myths and infects entire communities with rabid nationalism is, Hedges explains, a seduction. But not a seduction into some wonderful, joyful experience, but more like the influence of a succubus, dragging participants down into perversion, into degradation and annihilation. Part of the seduction is an imagined potential for heroism. The admiration, the high-blown rhetoric promises glory. It promises nobility. This euphoria entices people to go and join the violence. But all of this is a myth. The seductive and even noble is utterly smashed, just like so many other human things, once it reaches the battlefield. Quote, the German veteran of World War I, Erich Maria Remarque, in his book, All Quiet on the Western Front, wrote of the narcotic of war that quickly transforms men into beasts. He knew the ecstatic high of violence and the debilitating mental and physical destruction that comes with prolonged exposure to war's addiction. We run on, he wrote, overwhelmed by this wave that bears us along, that fills us with ferocity, turns us into thugs, into murderers, into God knows what devils. This wave that multiplies our strength with fear and madness and greed of life, seeking and fighting for nothing but our deliverance. Close quote. In this section, Hedges is dragging us with him into the worst realities of war. How wanton violence destroys compassion for strangers, for the weak. It eliminates all sanctity of life until dead bodies become no more remarkable than weeds sprouting in a ditch. Once brutality becomes a way of life, all social norms disappear. Rape, mutilation, abuse, theft, the murder of children and invalids, all becomes acceptable or at least not punished. War rewards those who have good survival skills regardless of their morality and sees those with decency and compassion dumped into mass graves. This shattering, this annihilation of every conviction, of every belief, the complete betrayal of faith explains the legion of broken men who return from war. The alcoholism, the depression, the broken families, and the ubiquity of PTSD among survivors. The reality of war is the perfect antidote to the myth, the promised glory, valor, and patriotism. Unfortunately, this antidote, this cure, is only available after the disease has already claimed all its victims. Five, the hijacking and recovery of memory. After war ends, societies do recover, but often at the cost of their memory, at a cost of forgetting what has been learned. The book shares a powerful quote from the novelist Milan Kundera. Quote, "The struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting." Close quote. Hedges points out that rarely do leaders ever face consequences for the costs of war. Most never end up tried, convicted, or put in jail for war crimes. Most often they simply drift into obscurity. What happened to Robert McNamara? What about the weapons of mass destruction that Dick Cheney and George Bush promised? Nixon was forced to resign, but not for the illegal secret bombings of Cambodia and Laos, but for the Watergate scandal. The Allies, after World War II, ensured we all know about the Holocaust, but we know far less about the bombings of Dresden or the rapes of German women. How many people remember the Armenian genocide? What do Japanese textbooks say about the rape of Nanking? Once the dust settles, once the fighting stops, once the bodies have been buried, and the combatants return home to suffer in silence, then the memory and the truth of the war becomes a brief opportunity to heal and inoculate us against further horrors. But more often than not, the truth remains just another forgotten victim of war. Six, the cause. Quote, "War finds its meaning in death. The cause is built on the backs of victims, portrayed always as innocent. Indeed, most conflicts are ignited with martyrs, whether real or created. The death of an innocent, one who is perceived as emblematic of the nation or the group under attack, becomes the initial rallying point for war. These dead become the standard bearers of the cause, and all causes feed off a steady supply of corpses. Close quote. Wars are justified on fear and on perceived victimization, self-defense or revenging of a martyr. Wars are always based on these lies or oversimplifications. But as long as citizens and soldiers can be convinced to be afraid or to be righteous, then the myth spreads and the support grows. Nationalism, the flag, us against them. At the end, it is a strange, too simple story like the one we tell to toddlers. Our shame is that the majority have been tricked into accepting the faith, into unquestioning belief in the myth over and over again. Seven, Eros and Thanatos. War and Hedges' experience is something that hijacks the human psyche. It is the impulse that engages our constant struggle between Eros, the instinct for connection, versus Thanatos, inevitable death and destruction. War supersedes our daily mundane existence, promising a spiritual fulfillment through purpose, fealty, self-sacrifice, and bold drama. This promise and its primacy cuts through the usual confusing babble of human emotions, and it acts like a narcotic. Where our usual normal human inadequacy and confusion once dominated, there's a searing, primal, instinctual meaning. All doubt can fall away to be replaced by an opportunity to become a part of something really meaningful and much, much bigger than ourselves. But this meaning is a meaning without any possibility for happiness. Quote, "To live only for meaning, indifferent to all happiness, makes us fanatic, self-righteous, and cold. It cuts us off from our own humanity and from the humanity of others." Close quote. Hedges goes on, quote, "In the beginning, war looks and feels like love. But unlike love, it gives nothing in return but an ever-deepening dependence. Like all narcotics, on the road to self-destruction. It does not affirm, but places upon us greater and greater demands. It destroys the outside world until it is hard to live outside war's grip. It takes a higher and higher dose to achieve any thrill. Finally, one ingests war only to remain numb. The world outside war becomes, as Freud wrote, uncanny. The familiar becomes strangely unfamiliar. Many who have been in war find this when they return home. The world we once understood and longed to return to stands before us as an alien, strange, and beyond our grasp." Close quote. It is this very element, the destruction of our humanity, that results in the greatest casualty rate of all, the mental health of combatants. Quote, "In the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, almost a third of all Israeli casualties were due to psychiatric causes, and the war lasted only a few weeks. A World War II study determined that after 60 days of continuous combat, 98% of all surviving soldiers will have become psychiatric casualties. They found that a common trait among the 2% who were able to ensure sustained combat was a predisposition towards aggressive, psychopathic personalities." Close quote. Sadly, when we're part of a community moving towards war, most of us will nonetheless succumb to the lure of war's narcotic effect. Those for whom patriotism is important are the most at risk. They often refuse to hear well-known truths about warfare, as that requires them to betray their faith and their sense of belonging. So there are always a steady supply of believers ready for the self-sacrifice of supposed duty. But once fully used up by the battlefield, they return to their communities as discarded veterans, troubled and often physically maimed. They feel betrayed, they feel misunderstood. Fitting back in becomes excruciating, and often they're shunted aside, left alone in their resentment and in their pain. human potential is truncated, if not destroyed. And it is with that, the heavy message about the cost of war, with the humanity and soul-destroying nature front and center, that Hedges closes his book. There's no encompassing summation, just a simple message. War is a narcotic, and it's deeply enticing. War is horrifying and universally immoral. War kills in huge numbers and leaves no one better off. Humans are wired to lust for war. Humans are destroyed in war. The message is clear. Hope is not. My personal reflection. For those of you who have watched my other videos, I don't think it's going to come as a great surprise that I consider myself pretty smart and certainly immune to many social delusions. But I also need to admit that I find war deeply affecting and, despite cognitive dissonance, alluring. I'm not an easy convert to hawkishness. I'm not pro-military, nor quick to support any armed conflict. I don't believe in glory. I don't believe in valor. And while I respect self-sacrifice, I don't immediately assume every soldier embodies the attribute. I refuse to worship any nation, and overt displays of patriotism make me shudder. Yet I know that the only reason I can maintain any pretense of pacifism is because of my circumstance. Given a different set of circumstances, I would don a uniform and pick up a weapon. The war in Ukraine has made that especially apparent to me. A dictatorship invading a democracy, a large, powerful country invading a weaker neighbor. As a Gen X Westerner, I was bottle-fed on anti-Soviet, anti-Russian propaganda. I am prepped for a pro-NATO, pro-Western Europe, and anti-Russian stance. Nonetheless, I've carefully cultivated a well-fortified skepticism about all things Western foreign policy, and a general dislike for Western involvement in international conflicts. Yet here I am, gleefully cheering on the Ukrainian resistance, supporting massive military aid, welcoming a rearming of Europe, and feeling vaguely obligated. In this, I recognize my own ability to ingest the narcotic of war, to allow a short circuit in my own emotional wiring to approve sanctioned state killing, to struggle to see Ukrainian nationalism as having the same evil flaws as nationalism everywhere. I find myself knowing and sympathizing with pro-Ukrainian positions, even when I know I've only heard the messages of one side. I find myself willing to imagine every Russian officer as a criminal. I find myself willing to believe that Ukrainians are being restrained and ethical in the defense of their nation and in their treatment of Russian prisoners. I find myself idolizing Zelensky and admiring the volunteer fighters. I know that if this invasion was happening to my home country, I would certainly have a gun in my hand, and I would also be trying to kill the invaders. My deeply human emotions make holding on to any intellectual pretensions or moral reservations intensely difficult. Hedges' book and my own reflections dovetails nicely with the central themes in the book Demonic Males, Apes and the Origins of Human Violence, covered in episode number 36. From an anthropological perspective, from a human behavior perspective, it is clear that humans are hardwired and instinctively prone to warfare. Deep in the common ancestry that our species shares with other primates, we became aggressively warlike. However, as Demonic Males also points out, the bonobo, a species closely related, managed to evolve out of warfare. So while Hedges' book paints a bleak view of our future, indicates the inevitability of horrifying human warfare, we also should be able to change this path. We won't change the path through any tools we've deployed so far. Diplomacy, international agencies, religion, international law, chivalry, the rules of war have all failed to curtail our penchant for mass slaughter. they stand powerless between the rush to war and a sense of national victimization. The real answer has to lie deeper. The real answer demands more from us. If the authors of Demonic Males are correct, we're going to need to challenge the entire nature of human society. We're going to change the nature of human relationships. We're going to need to upend our traditions of authority and hierarchy. We may need to dispose of nation-states altogether. Most religions, most educations, most organizations, especially state organizations, would need to change significantly. Many would need to be disbanded outright. We would need to create societies where our warlike instincts become antithetical to our community belonging, rather than as a component of our belonging. Using violence needs to become a tool only acceptable to outcasts and never necessary for a sense of belonging. But these changes are much more radical than anything people currently envision. They do not feature in any current political platform, and are only ideas relegated to the fringe theorists and naive activists. They are beliefs mocked by almost every authority in the majority of communities. These changes are the stuff of fantasy fiction. I, like the majority of humanity, stand powerless, hopelessly defaulting to support horrible future bloodshed. Hope remains extremely hard to see. So if you enjoyed this rather bleak video, then please, I would appreciate your like and subscribe. A comment, even a nasty one, will also help raise my engagement scores. So if you've got nothing nice to say, disobey your mother and roast away. I've taken a few weeks off as I needed a break to regain my enthusiasm for the channel, but as always, my desire to yell into the void has brought me back. If you're a returning viewer, thank you very much. I question your sanity, but I love your loyalty. This is XCG, wishing you, your family, and your community a violence-free trip down that road to freedom.